Sheep. So docile and harmless, right? Wrong. Sheep are the devil's spawn. They can bring you to your knees and even destroy romantic relationships. My trouble with sheep began when my boyfriend Trevor decided to buy some from some friends of his called Cecily and Tom. Well, at the time, Trevor and I were living on a communal farm in Scotland, and Cecily and Tom were hobby farmers who lived about an hour's drive away, and they had these 7 sheep of a rare breed called Soay. And you can see them here behind me. They kind of look like goats, and they even have these little horns, even the females. And they'd actually be adorable if they weren't possessed. Well, Cecily and Tom wanted to give us 7 ewes for the super low price of 40 pounds sterling, which was about 55 bucks. Now, I am an animal lover, but I also know a really bad deal when I see one. I was familiar with this particular breed of sheep because several years earlier, I lived on a farm that had Soways. And unlike Trevor, I knew Soways were a royal pain. They're smart, they're skittish, and they're independent thinkers. Not a good combination of traits if you want to control your livestock. Sheepdogs can't even round them up because these sheep scatter when they're chased. I did put my foot down, but a week later, Cecily and I were standing outside of their steel-sided barn, and inside the barn, Tom and Trevor were swearing and banging around trying to catch these sheep. Well, when all of them were captured and we put them in this horse trailer that we borrowed to bring back to our place, Tom's wiping the sweat and the straw and the muck from his face and his clothes, and then he says with this really evil grin, "Good luck." Well, back home, the sheep were going to stay in one of the duck pens temporarily while we spent time trying to patch this wholly sagging, poor excuse for a fence that surrounded the field where the sheep were going to live permanently. But the horse trailer was too big to drive into the duck pens so we could easily open it and let them out. But no, instead, we had to carry each one about 50 yards to the pen. But first, I had to catch them. Now it was my turn to swear while banging around inside this tin can of a horse trailer trying to catch 7 wild bucking sheep with horns and hooves. So 20 minutes and 50 bruises later, the sheep were nervously running around the pen trying to figure out how to escape. And like I said, this fence around the field where we were going to eventually move the sheep was completely inadequate for Soways. They can jump over fences, they can crawl under fences, they can slip through the tiniest of gaps. But Trevor didn't believe me. He's like, "They're sheep, not cats, not kangaroos." Well, a few days later, I had to tackle them a second time, one by one, so they could be wormed. And if they weren't so wild, catching them wouldn't have to involve these rugby tactics, right? So I'm try going like all Jane Goodall, like she did with the chimpanzees. I spend time in the pen. I'm talking to them softly. I'm trying to earn their trust and trying to get them to eat out of my hand. Well, forget it. They might as well have been wild apes. So a week later, I had to tackle them for a third time so we could move them from the pen into their field. And this time we put them in the back of this old Land Rover that we have, and you drove them to the field, and then we could open the door and let them jump out, and there they go. And everything was fine in this new field for a few weeks. But after these little beggars ate all the grass down to the nub, they started eyeballing the grass in the adjacent field, which literally was greener on the other side of the fence. But we didn't want them on the other side of the fence because also in that field were a bunch of tree saplings that we had planted, and sheep will eat trees. So they start escaping into this forbidden tree field, and to get them back, I would have to open the gate between the two fields and bribe them with a bucket of food pellets. Well, rinse, repeat every day for weeks, and I could not figure out how they were getting out. Well, at Christmas, Trevor and I went away, and our little horned Houdinis got into the neighbor's pasture, and the neighbor wasn't happy about our sheep mingling with his sheep. He told us later that it took his dogs 2 days to round them up, and when we were gone, they put the Soways back in the duck pen. So when Trevor and I got back from our trip, we had to spend some time making the fence in their rightful sheep field even higher. We figured if they were jumping over, if we added 2 extra strands of barbed wire along the top of the fence, it would stop them. But now we had to wrestle the sheep for a 4th time to move them from the duck pens back to their field. By now, these sheep were like totally confused whenever they saw me. They're thinking, is this lady going to attack us or feed us? And then they started escaping again. And one day I saw them going under the fence, just like a cat. So we added more wire along the bottom of the fence, and it worked. for 3 days. So Trevor and I started arguing all the time about a solution. Mine, of course, was lamb roast. And at one point, we stopped talking to each other and then we broke up. Well, this was the final strand of wool for me. These devils had to go. And Cecily and Tom agreed to take them back. They were actually going to buy them back from us because by this time they had built the Fort Knox of fences on their farm for imprisoning these Soways. But they weren't going to come and get them until I caught them first. So catching them inside a horse trailer or a duck pen was hard enough, but how was I supposed to catch them where they're romping around in this huge field? And then I had this brilliant plan. In their field, which they also shared with our hens, was this much smaller pen that was made out of chicken wire and 2x4s. It was an old unused chicken rearing pen, and it was about 8 feet by 8 feet by 4 feet high, and it was covered at the top with chicken wire, so nothing could jump out the top. And then and also down the sides, and it had this little door on one end. So on capture day, I crawl inside this pen and I dump a bucket full of food pellets in the far corner. And then I crawl out again and I hide behind a nearby chicken coop. Well, as soon as I was out of sight, the sheep were cautiously creeping over to the pen and they then went in and started eating this food. Well, I lunged for the door and shut them in. Voila. Told you my plan was brilliant. But the pen was built for chickens and it wasn't strong enough to hold these 7 panicked, crafty Soway sheep while we waited for Tom and Cecily to come and get them. So we had to move them to one of the chicken coops, which is made of sturdy wood planks. So for the 5th time, I had to tackle these sheep. And then the pen, like I said, was too low for me to stand up in. So I'm crawling around on my hands and knees and it's muddy and I'm lunging at them. I'm grabbing a leg here and I'm grabbing a horn there. And when all 7 were caught, I handed them one by one to Trevor and he bung them inside this chicken coop. And it was all good though, because this was going to be my last sheep rodeo. So I call Cecily and Tom and they say, oh, well, we can't come today. We're totally committed to breaking this horse. And I say, oh, well, so much for coming out right away as soon as I caught them. And then Tom says, well, to be honest, I didn't think you would catch them. And then there's this pause and this sigh. And then he says, okay, we'll come tomorrow. Well, that day that I had caught them was gearing up to be really sunny and hot, which was unusual for Scotland. And the Soways were going to roast in that chicken coop for 24 hours. So I brought them some more food and I brought them a bucket of water. And the coop had this one main door that was a big door where people could go in and out to, muck out the chicken coops. But at the bottom of that door, cut into the bottom of the door, was this little hatch and you can raise and lower it. And that's where the hens went in and out. But it was too small for a sheep to get out. So I opened that little hatch to let some fresh air in. And then I made sure the bigger door was latched tightly and I went about my business. Well, a few hours later, I came back to check on my sheep and the door to the coop was swinging open to and fro in the gentle breeze. And the sheep, they were peacefully grazing in the forbidden tree field. Well, this is the point where I drop to my knees, I put my head in my hands, and I am tugging at the roots of my hair, rocking back and forth and mumbling unintelligibly between sobs. I tried calling Tom and Cecily and said, look, don't bother coming because the sheep have gotten out. I have no idea how I'm going to catch them again because they are never going to fall for the old food in the chicken pen trick again. They're just too smart. But Tom and Cecily didn't answer their phone and their answering machine was turned off. And I thought, well, fine, let them drive an hour to our place and be pissed off that they came out here for nothing, which is exactly what happens. And I'd be a liar if I said it didn't make me happy to ruin their day. So they get there and they are a little pissed off. But then Tom says, well, we're here. We might as well try catching the sheep. And I give him this sideways glance that said a lot of unrepeatable things, but mostly it said, yeah, right. But I wanted so badly to get rid of these GD sheep. I had nothing more to lose. My sanity was already shot. So sheep rodeo number 6 was actually a bonus round. It was 3 mini rodeos in one because it took 5 of us 3 tries to chase these sheep through this lame funnel that we created out of some spare fencing materials and into the back of Tom's horse trailer. Now all of the sheep were in the trailer except for 2, which we saw bound over the top of the extra tall fence like a couple of kangaroos. The sheep ended up back in the neighbor's field with his sheep, and I thought, screw it, I am done. But unfortunately, the neighbor did not see it my way. Fortunately, he had a brilliant plan. His dogs would round up the two Soways in the middle of his big bunch of sheep, and then the dogs would drive the whole herd up the hill toward us where we were standing and shove them into the corner of this field. And then our little sheep would be trapped in the middle of his much larger sheep, and then Trevor and the farmer's son would leap into the sea of prancing, confused animals and capture the Soways. But by God, it worked. And if a couple of hours later, Tom came to get the last two sheep. So he had promised to refund our 40 pounds sterling once he had all of the sheep in his possession. But he only had a 20-pound note in his pocket, and he shoves it at me and he says, will you settle for half, petrol expenses and all? I had to drive out here twice, you know. And I'm thinking, the cheek. But what do you expect from an agent of the devil? Well, Trevor and I made up, and eventually we got married. And now whenever he comes up with an idea I don't want him to pursue, I just look at him and whisper, Sowe sheep. Thank you.
Well, we are really off to a great start at the Women's Festival. I'm delighted to hear that story. Sarah Snyder, that was fantastic. And relieved that sheep only eat trees, and realize we have themes coming up now, which must say something about women that has to do with eating, capturing, and in this case, a sort of a side of getting married. That was absolutely gorgeous. And now I want to introduce Sheila